Hello. So this week's lecture is going to be on over and under identification. So in this lecture, I'll be talking about false positives and false negatives, some cognitive bias in diagnosis, and then over and under diagnosis. So, starting off with false negatives and false positives, when a diagnosis is correct, that means there's truth in the measured aspect of what's going on and the reality of what the patient is experiencing. But some issues in diagnosis can come into play when we get to false positives and false negatives. So, I'll be talking about that more on the next slide. So, a false positive is also known as type 1 error, and this is when you receive a positive result for a test when you should have received a negative result. It's sometimes called like a false alarm or a false positive error, and it's usually used in the medical field, but can also be applied to other arenas such like software testing. So, an example of this would be if a pregnancy test is positive when you aren't pregnant, and researchers are consistently trying to identify reasons for false positives in order to make tests more sensitive. So, if a test for a disease is 99% accurate and you receive a positive result, what are the odds that you actually have the disease? So, if the disease is very common, your odds might approach 99%. But if it's a more rare disease, the less accurate the test and the lower the odds that you have the actual disease. And the difference can be quite dramatic. So, for example, if you test positive for a disease that affects 1 in 1,000 people, your odds might be less than percent of having the actual disease. And this reasoning involves conditional probability. So this leads to the false positive paradox. So what this means is first you have a test, let's say it's 99% accurate for the population. So if 100,000 people are in a population, then one person will have HIV from this test. That one person with HIV will probably test positive for the virus because the test has 99% accuracy. But what about the other 99,000, 999 people? The test will get it wrong 1% of the time. So, what that means is that out of the rest of the people who don't have HIV, about 100 will test positive. So, basically, if 100,000 people take this test, 101 will test positive, but only one will actually have the virus. And then we get into false negatives, which are known as type 2 error. So, a false negative is when a negative test result is incorrect. So, in other words, you would get a negative test result, but you should have gotten a positive test result. For example, you might take a pregnancy test and it comes back as negative. However, you could be pregnant still. And the false negative with a pregnancy test could be due to taking the test too early. And just about every medical test comes with the risk of a false negative, and false negatives can also happen in other areas, such as like software testing in the justice system. And false negatives can create two problems. So the first is a false sense of security. So, for example, if you're working in a manufacturing plant and they don't catch a defective item, you may think the process is running more effectively than it actually is. And it also could create a more serious issue when it comes to potentially dangerous situations that could be missed. Um, so now that kind of leads into cognitive bias. So we kind of talked about how tests can give incorrect diagnosis, but also the person administering the test can have cognitive bias when it comes to diagnosis as well. So I'm going to go over availability heuristic, anchoring heuristic, framing effects, and blind obedience. So, availability heuristic is basically when an individual diagnoses someone based on past experiences with past cases. So, basically, they might see these symptoms and have treated someone before with the same symptoms and think, oh, this looks the same as this past patient, so they must have this. And they don't really consider like outside factors, their past medical history, and things like that. This can happen a lot with mental illnesses. It tends to happen with that a little bit more than medical ones, because usually with more like physical illnesses, you would get a test kind of along with that. But this can happen a lot with mental illness, and that's why I talk about the biopsychosocial model a lot, because a lot of doctors do have these biases towards specific mental illnesses. So it's really important to get that environmental and sociological kind of aspect to it. And then with anchoring heuristic, this is when the doctor or mental health professional will kind of rely on something initial that they see in the patient, even though they might receive more information after that. So, for example, if, say, you have a patient who might be experiencing depression, but then they might have some anxiety kind of linked with that, if they just mention maybe the depression first, that doctor might just focus on that and not even consider there could be other things going on as well as when they're um, with more like physical symptoms, they might ignore like little things that they might think aren't that serious when it comes to the person's health, but then that could lead to something more potentially dangerous later on. And then framing effects are when a doctor or mental health professional will kind of make assumptions about why an individual has an illness based on other aspects of them, and not actually look at the patient fully. So the example I have here is someone who was addicted to heroin might have abdominal pain, and they were also treated for opiate withdrawal. And the doctor might think, oh, you're just having that abdominal pain because you're going through withdrawal, and not actually taking it as something more serious, because it could be something more serious later on. And then lastly, blind obedience is kind of when someone, regardless of what they believe morally or ethically, they kind of do what they're told by someone above them. And gut instincts tend to be ignored, and more value are placed on those medical tests. An example could also be wanting to assign a diagnosis to someone, but having like a boss or someone above you tell you that there's something else going on, and kind of going with what the more experienced person says. So, how do these actually develop? There can be a few reasons. One is it tends to be with more experienced doctors. They actually tend to have more bias because, they've been in the profession longer. They think they've seen everything, they know everything. Where actually it's been shown that more recent doctors, like ones that are newer to the profession, actually tend to have less bias, because all the information they've learned from school is more fresh in their mind, and they tend to be more kind of like by the book and by the rules for diagnosis, as well as with more experienced doctors. They tend to be less up to date on research and follow standards less closely, whereas newer doctors actually are more up to date on current research, and like I mentioned, kind of follow the standards more strictly. So that's why actually if you see a more recent doctor who's newer to the profession, you tend to get a more accurate diagnosis than if you see a doctor who's been in the profession for like 20 or 30 years. So, with false negatives, false positives, and cognitive bias, that can lead to either overdosing or underdiagnosing in mental health. So, many do argue that overdiagnosis is occurring because they see the number of those with a mental illness is rising over time. But also, another kind of factor with that, too, is the fact that more people are comfortable with seeking help for a mental illness, whereas in the past that may have not been the case. Um, so, one of the issues too with overdiagnosis in terms of using it in mental health is that it's more from like the physical kind of illness world, and it's transitioning over to mental health with the same definition. So, some reasons that this could be happening when it's actually not is, as I kind of mentioned, the stigma around mental illness is decreasing, and many more people feel comfortable seeking help, as well as just awareness overall. So many people may not realize they even have had a mental illness when they do actually have one and are starting to seek help also. And then on the other hand, with underdiagnosis, this tends to occur towards specific groups of people based on those cognitive biases. So, an example of this is women tend to get underdiagnosed in ADHD. Um, and this also occurs when a doctor kind of views a mental illness as looking one way in individuals and not really using that biopsychosocial model to actually get the full picture of what the mental illness looks like. So that is everything for this week's lecture. Our topics for next week is going to be cultural issues and mental health. You have your quiz 8 and module 8 discussion due this week. There's no reading for this week, and you should be receiving a grade for your research reflection paper by the end of next week, and that is due tonight by midnight.